All right, getting back to Childress, Foundations, beginning at page 65. And what we're doing is we're reading through Chapter 3, Personality and Attachment. The narcissistic personality structure has the same underlying core beliefs as the borderline personality organization regarding fundamental self, inadequacy, and ultimate rejection by the attachment figure. The difference is that the narcissistic style personality has been able to form a very rudimentary internalized psychological defense against the direct and continual experience of primal self inadequacy and fears of rejection/abandonment. The primitive narcissistic defense acts to stabilize the functioning of the narcissistic personality in relationships. As a result, the narcissistic style personality is not as prone to the wildly chaotic emotional and relationship displays evidenced by the borderline style personality, as long as the narcissistic defense is not threatened. If, however, the narcissistic defense is challenged, referred to as, quote, narcissistic injury, end quote, when the narcissistic personality will also collapse into displays of rage and psychological disorganization that are characteristic of the underlying borderline personality structure. The narcissistic defense of grandiose self-inflation protects the narcissistic personality against the direct experience of fundamental self-inadequacy and fears of abandonment. These core beliefs of self-inadequacy and fears of rejection are expelled by the narcissistic style personality onto the other person. The narcissistic style personality sits in judgment of the other person who is deemed to be inferior, therefore creating the narcissistic defense of self-inflation by comparison to the inadequate other. The narcissistic defense expels the experience of primal self-inadequacy and fundamental unlovability at the core of the narcissistic borderline personality onto the other person. I'm not the inadequate one. You are. By devaluating the other person, the narcissistic personality dismisses the importance of relationships with others because the other person is unworthy. In dismissing and devaluing relationships with the other inadequate person, the narcissistic defense is able to diminish the fears of rejection and abandonment, since relationships with others are of no inherent value. You're not rejecting me. I'm rejecting you. As a result of the narcissistic defense, the core beliefs of the attachment system that I am fundamentally inadequate and will be rejected by the other person because of my inadequacy are psychologically expelled through their projection onto others. You are the inadequate one, and I'm rejecting you because of your inadequacy. The modicum of structural support provided by this narcissistic defense against the continual and direct experience of the underlying borderline personality organization of primal self-inadequacy and impending rejection by the attachment figure provides the narcissistic personality with sufficient self-stabilization for adequate social functioning. The social presentation of the narcissistic defense of seemingly confident superiority and arrogant self-assertion can even be successful in some domains of work and in superficial social relationships. However, the fragility of the narcissistic defense and the deeper hidden pathology of the underlying borderline personality organization becomes highly problematic in intimate relationships where the internal working models of attachment expectations become unable to modulate the inevitable process of repairing breaches to the relationship. Since the narcissistic personality is not founded on attachment structures of authentic self-esteem, i.e., core schemas of self and other in relationship of I'm valuable, and I will be loved and nurtured by the other because of my inherent value, the narcissistic personality needs continual external validation from others for his or her value, referred to as narcissistic supply. For the narcissistic style personality, the role of other people is simply to provide this continual narcissistic supply of admiration to support the fragile narcissistic defense. This leads to the characteristic display of the narcissistic personality as exploitative in relationships with others. The sole role of the other person in the relationship with the narcissistic personality is to provide a perfectly fused reflection of the narcissist personality's own idealized self-perception, rather than forming a reciprocal relationship of appreciation and mutual regulation. The borderline personality shows the same exploitation of others in relationship, except for the borderline style personality The exploitation of the other is labeled as being manipulative. The uniting feature of narcissistic exploitation and borderline manipulation is their use of the other person as a means to meet the emotional and psychological needs of the narcissistic borderline personality. The other person's sole role in the relationship is to serve as an external regulatory object for the emotional and psychological state of the narcissistic/borderline personality. Since the underlying attachment structure of the narcissistic borderline personality is unable to repair breaches in the relationship, the narcissistic borderline personality seeks to maintain a continually fused psychological state with the attachment figure. The other person is exploited by the narcissistic borderline personality as an external regulatory object to serve the narcissistic reflection of the narcissistic borderline personality. The approaches of the narcissistic style and borderline style personalities differ in how they use the other person as a regulatory object, but both require that the other person in the relationship remain in a completely fused psychological state with the narcissistic borderline personality. The borderline style personality requires that the other person remains in a continually fused psychological state through perfectly attuned and constantly devoted attention to the moment-to-moment state regulation of the borderline personality. To achieve this continually fused psychological state, the borderline style personality seeks to seduce the other into an idealized image of perfect love, quote-unquote, in order to achieve a continual and perfectly fused psychological state with the attachment figure. The narcissistic style personality, on the other hand, adopts a style of superiority that seeks to dominate the other person into a submissive state in which the separate autonomy of the other person is nullified and made subordinate to the psychological state of the narcissistic personality. The personality styles differ, but the goal is the same. The borderline style personality seeks to seduce the other person into a continually fused psychological state, while the narcissistic style personality seeks to control and dominate the other person into a submissive psychological surrender to the psychological state of the narcissist. In dominating and controlling the relationship partner, the narcissistic style personality achieves the same perfectly fused psychological state as the borderline style personality, in which the other person acts as the regulating other for the narcissistic borderline personality organization. In a relationship with either a narcissistic or a borderline personality, there's only one person present in the relationship, the narcissist or borderline personality. The independent authenticity of the other person disappears from the relationship in order to meet the emotional and psychological needs of the narcissistic borderline person for a fused psychological state totally dedicated to regulating the emotional and psychological needs of the narcissistic borderline personality. If the attachment figure fails to be perfectly attuned, perfectly reflective, regulatory other for the needs of the narcissistic borderline personality, the result is a collapse of the narcissistic borderline personality organized structure into disorganized tirades of vitriolic rage, chaotic and irrational accusations, and exhibitions of supposed victimization. I've seen videos. I saw a video recently of a mother doing this to a child. The kid was about 6 at the time. And because the mother was afraid of losing custody, it was videotaped, and the mother just laid into this kid, telling her that she was going to destroy their relationship, and it was just crazy. But anyways, I think that was a good example of one of those borderline narcissistic rages, vitriolic rage, chaotic and irrational accusations, and exhibitions of supposed victimization. The chaotically angry intensity of these collapses of personality regulation by the narcissistic borderline personality lead the other person All right, so getting back to the end of this chapter on attachment and personality, particularly the attachment origins of personality traits. The chaotically angry intensity of these collapses of personality regulation by the narcissistic borderline personality lead the other person in the relationship into trying to respond in ways that avoid the collapse of the narcissistic borderline personality into dysregulation. in an effort to avoid the dysregulation of the narcissistic borderline personality, the other person surrenders into becoming the external regulatory other for the psychological and emotional state of the narcissistic borderline personality. Childress and other lectures that I've heard talks about how the key factor in setting up the parental alienation situation involves the child adopting the place of the abused victim. Once the child takes on that role and embraces it, everything else falls into place, and that child then becomes locked in to this inauthentic, like it says here, surrender into becoming the external regulatory other for the psychological and emotional state of the narcissistic borderline personality. In response to the unpredictable and volatile tirades of the narcissistic borderline personality, the other person in the relationship becomes highly motivated to remain empathically attuned to the internal emotional and psychological state of the narcissistic borderline personality in order to respond in ways that keep the narcissistic borderline personality in a regulated state. These children become role reversed, basically, to use a family systems term. And in fact, that reminds me, take a look at that. I've got a cool little book by Dr. Craig A. Everett called Family, let's see it here, Family Therapy Glossary. And in her here they have quotes from others that have written extensively on family systems and her roles. We see here, it says, a concept from family theory that describes images and or positions with characteristic behaviors that are assigned to a specific members to perform certain functions within a family system. They may represent normative positions such as parent or a child, or dysfunctional positions such as a parentified child or a scapegoat. That's from Mnuchin, 1974, and Ackerman, 1958. The Mnuchin, 1974, is families and family therapy, and the Ackerman, 1958, is the psychodynamics of family life. And when we look at parentification, we read that parentification is a family systems dynamic where a child is assigned a caretaker role for one or both parents, and often for the siblings too. This designated child assumes excessive responsibility in a pseudo-adult role by emotionally and or physically caring for either a weak parent or sibling or a vulnerable parental marriage. This role diffuses marital stress and reciprocally reinforces the power of the child in the family. There's often an associated effect of sibling rivalry. In some family systems, the parentified child may be more vulnerable to incidents of incest or physical abuse, and that's from Bozmenyanagi and Spark, 1973. Which is called Invisible Loyalties, Reciprocity in Intergenerational Family Therapy. That one sounds interesting. I think I'd like to find that and read that book. It sounds good. One other related term is scapegoating. Take a look at that. A family system dynamic that describes the process by which a family designates a member to carry and act out the stress and dysfunction for other members of the subsystems or subsystems of the family. For example, often a child is designated to carry this stress, and it may be displayed in depressive symptoms or delinquent behaviors. A family therapist may see a child acting out due to underlying conflicts in the parent's marriage. That's Vogel and Bell, 1960. The name of their article or book is the emotionally disturbed child as a family scapegoat. And that's in N.W. Bell and E. Vogel, editors of The Family from the Free Press. One other thing is called the identified parent-child, or the identified patient. That's a term developed early in family therapy to designate the family member who displays the symptoms and for whom therapy has been sought. The identified patient often may be labeled by the family as crazy or sick. And that's from Satir. And that was one of the scenarios that family systems therapists saw over and over again. That's from her Conjoint Family Therapy from 1967 through Palo Alto, California, Science and Behavior books. But anyways, getting back to this, Rappaport 2005 identifies a person who is in a relationship with a narcissist as being co-narcissistic. I was thinking of that codependency, no more type of stuff from Beatty. The co-narcissistic relationship partner essentially disappears in the relationship. According to Rappaport, there is psychologically only one person present. The co-narcissist disappears for both people, and only the narcissistic person's experience is important. The other person in relationship with a narcissistic borderline personality is required to be a mere reflection of the psychological state, narcissistic/borderline personality. Both personality styles reflect the use of the other person as an externalized regulatory object to support the inadequate self-regulation of the underlying borderline personality organization. In the case of the narcissistic style personality, the use of the other person as a regulatory object is characterized as exploitation, while for the borderline style personality, it is described as manipulation. The process of using the other person as a regulatory object for the emotional and psychological state of the narcissistic borderline personality organization becomes directly applicable to the understanding of the pathology of the parent-child relationship being expressed in attachment-based, quote, parental alienation, end quote. The narcissistic borderline parent forms a cross-generational coalition with the child against the other parent as a means to use, exploit, manipulate the child's induced symptomatic rejection of the other parent to regulate the core vulnerabilities of the narcissistic borderline personality of primal self-inadequacy and abandonment fears that were activated through the divorce. The child is being used as a regulatory object by the narcissistic borderline parent to expel from the narcissistic borderline parent the primal self-inadequacy and abandonment fears onto the other parent, who, by means of the child's rejection, becomes the inadequate parent/person who is the one being rejected and abandoned because of the fundamental inadequacy of this parent as a person. The child is being used as a regulatory object by the narcissistic borderline parent through the formation of a cross-generational coalition in which the child is induced into rejecting the targeted parent. That's really fascinating, I think.